we're not teaching earned value management in here, but we need to understand how the concept works and how the pieces fit together. So the three primary pieces are what? In project management world, if I do this, you think
Cost.
schedule,
Scope.
budget, right? Scope, right? Cost, schedule, budget. Cost, scope, schedule, and budget. Three pieces, right? So if I'm showing you this kind of a picture, where is scope represented?
WBS.
In the WBS, and schedule's represented with the bars on the Gantt chart. So that leaves us with the cost part of the triad, right? So what we said was, if I understood how much each of these tasks were going to cost me, and I could spread that cost across time, I would create, let's say that's project management, and I'm going to have 4 FTEs working on it for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever those 6 periods are. I can come up with a cost per period. Everybody comfortable with that as a concept? Well then, for each one of these tasks, I can come up with a cost during that time period. Are you okay with that? I know what the work is. I know what the time period is. I know what the level of effort is, so I can come up with a dollar value. So in this time period, the dollar value is just going to be that one task, right? That's you starting that project you were talking about. During this time period, I have this dollar plus those dollars plus a little bit here and a little bit there. If I could add all of those up, I would come up with a cost for that period, right? So that cost is going to be somewhere right here. Now, if I add this to this and put that right there, what have I got then?
Cumulative spend.
Cumulative spend. So I'm spending this much in one, this much in two. If I continue that on out, here, here, and here, I come up with a cumulative spend plan that goes out here somewhere. Right? I'm going to add up the dollars in 1. 1 and 2 gets me this. 1 plus 2 plus 3 gets me this. Remember that? Everybody, you're comfortable with that conceptually. Is that true? That's the way I create the cumulative spend plan. Now, in earned value management, what I do is I come back here and I say, okay, during period 2, or during period 1, we spent this, and during period 1 and 2, we spent this. And then we ask the question, how are we doing? Are we ahead of schedule, behind schedule, overspent, underspent? If I put that dot right there, what do you say? Okay, 99% of the people say we're overspent. What do the other people say? I heard somebody say it depends on what we got done, and somebody said it depends on the scope you've accomplished. Okay, same thing. So in order to do earned value management, I still have to have all 3 pieces. How much time has passed, how much money did we spend, and how much work did we get done. And let me show you as an example. If I got all of this work done, if I got all of this work done, and all of this work done, and all of that work done, and half of that work, and half of that work, how am I doing?
Very fantastic.
Yeah, I'm actually doing good, aren't I? Especially if I've only spent this much. Now, there's some assumptions in there we made about the value of that work I just circled, right? But we're probably right. The point is to recognize that just because I have cost data and schedule data, I still don't know how I'm doing from a project perspective until I know how much work had I planned to do and how much work did I get done. Is everybody comfortable with that as a concept? Okay, one more concept I want to make sure you leave with today is this is called earned value. So I do work and I earn a certain amount of value. So let's say that I estimated this was going to cost $10,000. And when I did that piece of work, but it cost me $8,000 to do it. Good or bad?
Good.
That's good. It cost me $12,000 to do it. Good or bad?
Bad.
Bad. Okay. But when I do my earned value calculation, what do I claim?
10,000.
10. Every time. If it took me 8, I still claim 10. If it took me 12, I still claim 10. Does everybody understand that? Whatever I estimate it to be, that's how much value I can claim. Do you understand that? So see the importance of budgeting appropriately, because when I come back to claim value, what value am I going to claim?
Yes, ma'am.
Whatever I estimated it was going to take. So now I'm going to compare what I spent, $8,000, with what I thought it was going to take, $10,000. And you just told me that's good. But if it takes me 12 to get it done, how much value do I claim? 10. Is everybody comfortable with that conceptually? Okay? So see the connection then between doing the budget and then doing the work, and it's still all three pieces: scope, schedule, and budget to do earned value. So earned value management is a tool that we use for controlling schedule. Leads and lags, you've already talked to me about. Schedule compression, I talked about this a minute ago. In the PMI space, there are actually two different schedule compression concepts that we talk about. One is crashing, which means I'm going to throw a bunch of resources on it and try to get that work done as quickly as possible. The other is fast tracking, which means I've planned for tasks to be done in parallel, in series, but I'm going to pull them back and I'm going to go ahead and start this one that I was going to do in the future at the same time, and I'm going to work them in parallel. Now, earlier this morning, you guys told me that anytime I compress the schedule, I may create other issues. That's something you need to understand, right? Schedule compression can be a really good thing, whether you're talking about crashing or fast tracking. And those definitions are things you might want to know what they are, right? But they come with other costs or other potential costs. And the one that I mentioned this morning, or you guys mentioned to me, that most people don't think about are how schedule compression impacts risk. Okay? Concept we need to understand. Scheduling tools, I'm sure Tony probably talked to you about that. And then the outputs, work performance information, schedule forecast. We talked about producing those change requests. And then you guys are familiar with this. Inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques. Tony talked to you. Oh, that is something he said to me, is he told you guys he has all of these forms, and if you want them, we can get them to you. So if you're interested in that and you want to send me a note, then we'll either set up a place on Blackboard or some way, figure out a way to get those to you. All right. So that's the schedule piece. Now let's talk about cost management. And a lot of these concepts will look very familiar. Okay. How many processes? Correct. 4. 4 processes. And how many process groups? 2. Correct. And project cost management is called a what? Knowledge area. there are, how many knowledge areas? 10, okay? So, and if you want to see how those look together, you're going to look on page 61, and you'll see process groups and knowledge areas and how PMI is decided to organize. So, these three processes are in what process group? Planning. So we're going to plan cost management, estimate costs, and determine the budget, which you guys just described to me why that might be important. We'll talk about it in a minute. And that's in planning, and then control cost is in monitor control. And we're going to expect that that's probably going to look something like controlling schedule looked earlier, right? Or that's what we're kind of predicting is going to happen. All right, so one of the things that happens on a regular basis is when we talk about the planning part of project management, and we talk about the outputs, people want to think in terms of this is what's going on in the project. In some cases, I won't say in many cases, but in some cases, in the planning process or the planning function, all that ends up coming out is a description of how we're going to do what it is we're talking about doing. Right? So we're just coming out with the plan. We're not talking about actually doing the work. We're obviously not talking about monitoring and controlling the work. We're just saying, okay, now I've got a plan. So as we look at this part of the planning process group and look at the outputs, let's think about where are we really in the PMI world, in the project management implementation world. We have used the expression project management plan quite a few times over the past few weeks and said that that's going to be part of the project management plan, or we're going to develop the project management plan. In fact, at the break here, somebody asked me, for the project you guys are doing, do you really have to do all of those components? And I've said no. The exercise is to do the 2 or 3 or whatever I ask for on the syllabus there. So focus on those. You might have to do some other pieces in order to get, to finish the communications plan, for example. I have to do some thought about stakeholders, right? If I'm going to do a communications plan. But I don't need to develop a stakeholder register specifically if I didn't ask for it. Okay, does that make sense? And I'll tell you now, I don't know the answer to this. I think I know the answer, but I'm not sure. Do you know how many elements there are in the project management plan? The project management plan is made up of 13 or 16 or what is it? What's the answer?
I'll say 16.
16 different plans, right? And those plans are outputs from other processes. So if your management says to you, I want you to develop a project management plan, what's that assignment really about? Is it about producing one plan?
No.
No. It's probably about producing 16 plans. Or if you really do get to sit in the project management seat, it may be about producing 3 or 4 of those and working with other organizations that are going to do the risk management plan or the communications plan or the stakeholder plan or whatever other plans. Do you have that graphic there? Did you find that by any chance? No, that's not the one I'm thinking about. I thought there is a really good graphic somewhere that defines all the elements, and it tells you where each of those elements come from. And that would make a really good test question.
Hint, hint.
Hint, 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 okay? And the reason I think that's good is that's something that can be of value to us when somebody says, we need to do a project management plan. For a lot of people that aren't in this space at all, don't live in this space, when you tell them you need a project management plan, what do they visualize and what do they hear?
One plan. One plan.
One plan, and what is it primarily?
Just a schedule.
That's exactly right. This is what most people visually see when you say a project management plan, right? They see a Gantt chart with something over here to the left that implies there's some stuff to be done. People that are steps above that might understand that this is a work breakdown structure, and what does the work breakdown structure represent? I know Tony said this.
Task required to complete the job.
Task required to complete the job. But he has an expression he uses every time. WBS is not schedule. WBS is not cost. WBS is work. I can't believe you didn't say this. Work content. WBS is work content. So this is what people see in their mind when you say project management plan. Now you know better, because you know project management plan now includes what else? Communications. What else? Risk. What else? It does have some budget information. Scope is in there. So you're now beginning to understand that, oh, the project management plan is all of these different plans rolled into one. Yeah, stakeholders is a piece of that. Okay? All right. All right, so cost management. You consider stakeholders early in the project planning. That makes sense to me. I suspect he talked about this because it's a point that we emphasize a lot. We talk about these as if they're two separate things, and PMI separates them out into cost management and time management. However, we all understand how they are linked together. And I just gave you a concept during our last discussion about a couple of concepts that tie those together. You remember what that was? In time, we talked about duration and level of effort. You need to understand those two concepts and how they relate to one another. Now, could you then describe to me how those concepts relate to cost management? See, that's a level of understanding you would want a project manager to have. That I understand that there's duration, there's level of effort, and then that relates to cost management. Right? Now, could you go the third step then if I said to you, so, if I asked you to crash the schedule, can you give me an analysis of how that might impact other project management issues, such as risk? It was right on the tip of your tongue, right? Just right. You gave it to me earlier. One of you did. All right. Do you see how that's a project management understanding? Now I've tied schedule to scope to risk. Could you speak to quality? I understand we haven't discussed quality or risk as a separate knowledge area yet, but you can intuitively think, oh yeah, I can see how crashing a schedule might impact quality management, right? Right?
Right.
Thank you. All right. Ability to impact schedule greatest earlier in the project. That makes sense, right? We've even seen that graphic that's in one of the earlier chapters of the PMBOK where it talks about our ability to make changes and influence cost and risk is highest early on, and then it decreases as the project continues, right? So while we're in the planning stages, we have the most opportunity to reduce risk and influence the cost of the project. But as the project goes on, our ability to make changes really goes down. So therefore, we should be figuring out ways that we can influence early successful progress. All right. Plan cost management. What do you expect as an output? Cost management plan, exactly. Oh, there you go, cost management plan. Inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques. Project management plan is going to include the scope baseline, the schedule baseline, and some other stuff that's in there. Okay, so are you going to expect to look in the execution process group and find a process for cost management? Well, it was horribly asked, so somebody bail me out here.
No,
Thank you. No, why not? Who said no? Somebody said.
I just guessed at
You
it.
knew it was yes or no, right? 50-50 chance. What we said is, if we have a baseline, you don't execute a baseline, right? You execute against a baseline. So which process group would you expect to see it in? Monitoring and controlling. You're going to look at the baseline to see how you're doing. So you told me you're going to collect schedule data, and you're going to look at the schedule baseline and measure how we're doing. Would you expect that to be similar in the cost space? Yeah, I'm going to have a cost baseline. I'm going to collect data, and I'm going to compare it to what? The cost baseline, the cost plan, which is the cost baseline, all right? Is that helpful or just confusing? Or both, a little of both, okay? Here's the takeaway for this. If you see baseline, you're not going to execute a baseline. You're going to execute against the baseline, and you're going to monitor and control against the baseline. All right? So it's something that you do, and you understand how that makes sense from just a project management 101 perspective, right? I'm going to produce a plan, and that plan is going to include a schedule and a spend plan. In the PMI space, then I'm going to monitor and control against those two baselines. Now, I'm actually going to have three. You have any idea what the third would be? Scope baseline, right? I'm going to define the scope, and I'm going to measure against that. And if it changes, I'm going to call that scope creep. All right? All right. Very good. Project charters and input. EEFs and OPAs. Are you becoming comfortable with what EEFs and OPAs are? A little bit. My recommendation is read some of those lists and pause for a second. This will cause us to pause and say, okay, I need to focus just for a second. What space am I in? I'm in planning cost management. That's the space I'm in. So in planning cost management, some of the enterprise environmental factors we need to think about are organizational culture and structure. That makes sense that the culture would impact cost management. Market conditions, that's an EEF, right? We said in general, and there's an exception, but in general, EEFs are internal or external? External. But then I said an organization's culture and structure. So it's external to the project, right? In general. Because later on I'm going to give you an exception, and somebody's going to say, hey, you said, and I'll agree with you, I did. All right. Current exchange rate for projects. So if we're working across countries or we're doing global projects, then exchange rates would be an EEF as we think about planning cost management. because there may be a cost associated with it. It could be positive or negative if we're talking about exchange rates, right? Did I tell you about the lady that worked for me that went to work in Bosnia? Have I told you that story? Well, I worked for Parsons 20 years ago or something, a long time ago. And I was running the Oak Ridge office here for Parsons. I had a lady that worked for me that was invaluable. She was super smart. She handled some accounting stuff, some HR stuff. She was extremely valuable to the organization. And she came to me and said, hey, we just won this big project in Bosnia. We're building roads and bridges and churches and schools, and turns out we were building targets. We didn't know it at the time, but that's the way life works, right? But really, really interesting work. And she said, we need somebody there that can deal with paying all of these vendors, because we're trying, we're using to the maximum potential local contractors and local resources, because part of this was about building the economy, right? And building things back up. So really, really good opportunity. And she says to me, what do you think about me taking this job? I said, Beth, if you think this is a career opportunity for you, I think it's a fabulous opportunity. I'll support you 100%. Whatever I need to fill out, whatever I need to do to help, I'll be glad to help. So she applies, she gets the job. So I have this really good buddy at the time who works at the Oak Ridge National Lab, who is also a friend of Beth's. And he calls me and he goes, we happen to be in a management program together at the time. And he calls me and he said, Rodney, how bad a manager do you have to be to have an employee that wants to go to Bosnia? I mean, think about it that way, but all she wants to do is get away from you. That's probably part of it, but anyway. But the point there was, her job was dealing with exchange rates and dealing with getting these people paid on a project that was a multi-million dollar project. So anyway, that's something you have to think about. OPAs, now we're talking about internal to the project, right? So project controls, financial databases. So now, I hope that some of you are saying, that's a little bit confusing, because you're saying internal and external and environmental factors and OPAs, and it's not that black and white. It's not that clearly delineated. And I would agree with you 100%. My point would be to understand what are OPAs and what are EEFs, and just understand when they're inputs and when they're outputs. And in most cases, when they're inputs, would you expect them to be inputs to planning or execution? Planning in most cases, right? I'm going to think about, okay, when am I going to use these factors that affect my schedule, my plan for my schedule, or my plan for my cost? In general, it would make sense that that would be during the planning function, right? I don't want to wait till I'm executing, or even worse, what? Monitoring and controlling, or heaven forbid, would you expect to ever see an input on closure? I hope not. But you understand now, you understand the concept and how they put it together, so that makes a little more sense to you. All right, tools and techniques, expert judgment. Remember, we got back to that a minute ago when we were saying I'm preparing a cost management plan. I'm going to draw on people who've done this kind of thing. They've done this work. They know the kinds of people it takes. They know the kind of resources it takes. And then some analytical techniques. And we'll talk in a minute about some of the analysis that we'll do. Do you guys take a engineering economy class as a part of this program?
Yes.
Okay, great. So a lot of the tools you use there are the things that you would look at here, and I'll point at these later. But being able to do things with time value of money is, and if you think about if projects are long enough, or you're having to fund phases of projects, then it would make sense that you would want to understand something about time value money. Now, in the world that we've lived in for the past few years, where inflation is less than 1% or less than 2%, does it really make a big difference on a 1 or a 2 year project? Not at all. On a 10-year project, yeah, I want to be concerned about it. But I mean, if you're living in a space where, you know, inflation was 10% or 12%, or, you know, in some of these countries where inflation is 80 or 90%, then are you going to want to do these kind of analyses? Sure you are. It makes a difference then. And does it make sense to you then to have a comment like financial decisions may affect project risk? Right? Could you expound upon that? For example, and then give me an example of where that's the case. This is exactly what I was just talking about, understanding how to do future value, present value calculations. Has everybody got that calculator? As you can, it has N, I, PV, and FV. You input 3 of them, and oh, you need that calculator. Excel will do that too, but you know, all right. Again, for the test, what's the potential pit? Wait, let me stop for a second. Does everybody understand how to do those calculations using some kind of a little 4 data input? You input 3 and it calculates the 4th. You put in the number of terms, the interest rate, the present value, and it'll calculate future value, or it'll calculate payments. If you don't, you need to become comfortable with that either through Excel, or there are all kinds of really cool calculators that will calculate payments for you. Here's the heads up and the potential pitfall of using those things. Whatever interest rate you use needs to be consistent with the number of periods you use. So if I'm using 12% annual percentage rate and I want to do a monthly payment, what interest rate do I put in there? Which is 1% per period. Okay, that's the kind of thing that'll catch you on a test. Is they'll give you a 12%, and they'll want you to do a 36-month future value or a 3-year future value calculation, and then you'll have to calculate, well, what's the monthly interest rate? 1%. Everybody okay with that conceptually? Just okay, I understand. It just needs to be consistent. You can do it either way, annual or monthly or whatever period they ask you for. So make sure you understand that. And you can use these formulas to calculate. I recommend you get a calculator that allows you to input and if that's something you don't understand or you need some more discussion of, I'll be glad to talk to you about that. And of course, tools, techniques, meetings, and other for planning cost management. And we're going to end up with a cost management plan that has things like in it, you know, how often are we going to collect data, what data are we going to collect, what currency are we going to talk in, you know, what's our level of precision? Are we talking in hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars, nickels, kroner, whatever. Cost management plans and input into the next 2 cost management processes. That won't surprise us. All right. There's the cost management plan. We just talked about this. Control thresholds. So at that point, we have the cost management plan. Remember I said earlier on, all we're doing right there is producing the plan that says, here's how we're going to manage cost. So that's all that is about. So the output is just the cost management plan. And you see that's an input into several other processes. Estimate cost. You guys have a estimating organization in your organization. I suspect you do. There are professional estimators. There are certifications that you can get in estimating. So when you have the opportunity to draw on those subject matter experts or that expertise, use that. There's all kinds of documentation out there related to standards for what it takes to do a certain kind of job, or what kind of technical capabilities you need to do certain kinds of jobs. Use that expertise. Those of you at ORL and at Y12, are you thinking, yes, but? Okay, yes, but what?
Not in our world.
What?
Not in our world.
Not in your world. Why not?
Red tape, culture. Mainly culture.
You got another thought? Because I'm going to agree with that one. You got another thought? That's a little bit more generic. He used the expression culture there and red tape, bureaucracy. Does that have an impact on how long it actually takes to get work done?
I meant that as three different reasons.
Oh, yeah. And I agree with you. What's the more general comment about that related to estimating? What do you have to know?
Environment,
Yeah, the environment, the culture. What I'm looking for here is I've got to know what world I'm working in as I think about estimating getting that work done. Because if I'm working in or around a nuclear facility or a nuclear reactor, is it going to take longer or shorter? Cost more or less? Right? Well, you know that intuitively. So what would you do if you're estimating that kind of a job? Okay, you're going to double to start with.
Yeah, maybe more.
Okay.
I think it's more double squared kind of.
Double
Double squared, and then you're about in the right ballpark.
So a buddy of mine told me one time, this is another buddy of mine that worked out the national lab. He said, here's the way you do it. You think, what would it take me to do this at home if I only had access to my Craftsman tool set, right? Whatever it is, you double the number and take the next unit. So if I could do it at home in 2 days, that's 4 weeks. Right? If I could do it at home in 3 hours, that's 6 days. Right? Now that was his kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of, how do you estimate it? But you're liking that?
Pretty close.
Okay.
The estimate at ORL is take twice as long, spend twice the money, and get an award for it.
Yeah.
And get an award. I'm liking that too. All right. All joking aside, because I'm sure you're saying all this tongue-in-cheek. The point there for us is to recognize I've got to understand the environment, because there are environmental influences on estimating. And if I'm doing something in a hazardous environment, if I'm doing it underwater, if I'm doing it in space, if I'm doing it in a nuclear environment, it's different. Now, we almost flippantly, and I'm guilty of this, we almost flippantly say double it and take the next unit, right? The point is, there's enough information out there to help us do a decent estimate in those kind of environments. Because there are people that have been working in it for a long, long time. And do I want to talk to the guy who's running the HIFER about estimating jobs in the HIFER? Probably not, right? He might be, there you go. Who do I want to talk to?
people on the bottom.
The craftsman, the crafts person. That's who I want to talk to because they know how long something really takes. They know, hey, if you guys are going to force me to wear 3 pair of gloves and change my boots out every 30 minutes, then it's going to take me a long time to do this job. But I can tell you how long it's going to take. So the point there for us is, and I'm kind of knocking on local because that's the experience I've got. But it's true if you're talking about underwater or if you're talking about working on a drilling rig. You know, there are standards. It takes longer than what it says in the Means Handbook to do jobs in special environments. Well, take advantage of that expertise and when we do estimates. All right. Kinds of estimates. Again, definitions that would be useful to us: rough order of magnitude, budgetary estimate, definitive estimate. And what we're doing here is we're looking for what's our confidence level around those numbers, and then what am I going to use those to do, right? If I'm looking at just a rough order of magnitude estimate, that's a high level estimate performed fairly early, and I know that it's going to be off. Scope's not even fully known. So the range is generally minus 50 to double the actual what it's going to take. What's the problem with giving your boss a rough order of magnitude estimate?
That they're gonna say that's what you said.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to get written down, put in an email, sent to DOE, and that's what's going to get funded. Now, that's okay if you're high by 100%. If you're off by minus 50, right? Now, as project people, somebody said the exact right answer a minute ago. As project people, how would you respond to that? And still potentially be a win for you. You're going to lose, but don't run away, because that's all what you said.
Plus minus.
Okay, you can do that. You know, give them a range and say it's going to be in here. But what's the missing piece right now that you still control? Scope. Somebody said that a minute ago. Scope's not defined. So, you know, yeah, I said we could do it for $100,000. This is what I have in mind. And now I build my box around it. Because I still have control of scope and what else right now. Right? I'm giving you a number. But we're only talking about one piece. Yeah, yeah. I can get it done for that number if you'll give me 8 years. Right? And let me work on it on the weekends. And yeah, all right, okay. Again, know the pitfalls, know the risks to us as a project manager, but these kind of estimates get made all the time. Budgetary estimate. Now, in theory, this is where I'm really going to start talking about getting money, because that, you know, we're going to call that a budgetary estimate. The pitfall for us as project people is if I give a rough order of magnitude estimate to the wrong people, that's going to become my number. So just be careful. You know that. You've seen it, or you might have seen this before. Yeah, I think these are, the arrows are going the wrong way, right? Less accurate up here, more accurate down here as we get a more definitive estimate. And we sometimes talk about definitive estimates as what kind? Bottoms up. You heard that? We're going to, yeah, there it was down in the corner. Kinds of cost. Makes good test questions. Fixed cost, variable cost, direct and indirect cost. Direct costs are what? Chargeable to the project. Indirect, you got some examples of those. Overhead costs. Sometimes facility costs are in overhead, sometimes they're not. It kind of depends. Sometimes equipment costs are fixed. And now, can you think of situations where something might be considered a fixed cost, but it actually would change during a project? Let's say I had facility costs where I have all of my engineering staff, and that's a fixed cost on a project, that facility cost is, right? Can you imagine a situation where it might change?
Yes.
Rent changes, lease
If
changes.
your project has to go out to an external because of the work allocation committee decides that in the middle of your project?
Hypothetically speaking, right? Yeah, but it could change in any of those scenarios. So the fact that we call it a fixed cost, that's the way we're going to deal with it on the project. That doesn't mean it wouldn't ever change. If I grow my engineering staff and I have to get more space, that number might change, but it's still a fixed cost to the project. Does that make sense? No comment?
I was thinking of a different example. It wouldn't be productive to talk
Okay.
about it.
Another one of these hypothetical examples that you've never experienced. All right, you understand for estimating costs, lots of tools and techniques to us. Inputs, the PMP, that makes sense. A human resource plan, does it make sense you would use that to estimate costs? Sure, what kind of people I have, when am I gonna have them? The scope baseline, now I'm starting to pull the pieces together. Does it make sense that I wanna know something about the scope baseline to produce an estimate? Well, yeah, you guys just told me that was an important thing to know. The WBS and the WBS dictionary. You understand what these two pieces are now, right? This is the list of tasks, but somewhere we have to specifically say, for that task, well, what's the scope, schedule, budget for that task? And that might be in the WBS baseline. The schedule, okay, makes sense. Risk register. Consider the cost of risk responses. And we'll talk about that when we talk about risk, but does it make sense that I'm going to analyze risk and I'm going to say, I'm going to do some things to prevent these bad things from happening. Well, if I'm going to do something to prevent something bad from happening, what have I just said?
You're going to spend money.
Yeah, I'm going to spend money and resources and schedule, right? So if I develop risk responses, I've just modified my cost, schedule, scope, right? I've changed the WBS, so that would make sense. EEFs and OPAs, well, that makes sense. Here are a couple of other definitions you're going to want to kind of have, you're going to want to have a feel for and some understanding of. When I'm doing estimating, I can do analogous estimating, and I guess Tony talked to you about that under time management, but I've done this before. This is kind of like that, so I can come up with a reasonable estimate. Parametric estimating. Okay, we've done 50 of these and they cost us so much. What if we did 5,000 of them? What would that cost us? So I can make an estimate that way. And then bottoms up estimate is going to be the most precise, going to give us the best number. Why don't I do that every time? It's expensive. That's right. Takes longer, costs more. 3-point estimates, Tony talked to you about this, right? A couple of different ways to do that with triangular distribution and a beta distribution. That was with time, the same thing as with cost. Calculating the standard deviation, you know how to do that? You guys are getting this all out of your stats class, right? Why do we calculate variance? Why don't we just use standard deviation? I'm sorry, I talked to
Because it's evil. That's what we're talking.
That's what you were taught. Okay. It is, but why don't we just use standard deviation?
So you have negatives?
Because you have negatives, and therefore,
They may equal out.
yeah, they may equal out. So if I square them and I add them,
Cumulative.
then it's cumulative. And the best description for me was somebody talking about doing line fitting. You guys have probably already done all this, right?
Yes.
Right? And so there's the variation. So if I just add all of those up, I end up with 0. Well, I really don't have 0 variation, do I? But if I square all of them up and then add them and then take the square root, then I end up with a understanding of how much my line varies from my data. Does that make sense too? So the reason we talk about variance is because if I just added up the standard deviations, by definition, it would end up as 0, right? Remember that from when you're fitting a line to minimize the variation. So if I do it really well, what do I end up with? 0, right? So that's why you square standard, and the fact that it's evil is also an appropriate response. Okay?
That'll count on this.
You understand standard deviation? I do want you to get this. When we do budgets, you end up with 2 reserves, a contingency reserve and a management reserve. And those of you that are old as I am, you'll remember the vice president talked about, or he wasn't even vice president, talked about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. In the project management world, we identify risks. And if we identify a risk, it's a known unknown. We don't know what's going to happen or if it's even going to happen, but it's a identified concern. And we're going to attach amount of money to that. And that's going to become our contingency reserve. So if that bad thing happens, where do I pay for it? Huh? Out of the contingency reserve. That's correct. So I've done all my risk analysis. I've come up with a budget related to all those risks, and I've set it over to the side. Then that bad thing happens, I pay for it out of that pile of money. Right? Now, if I get down the schedule so far that that risk is no longer a concern, what do I do with that money?
Put it in your pocket.
That's right. Boom. It goes right to the bottom line. So, contingency reserve is a good thing. What's the potential pitfall of making it too big?
Lose contract.
Yeah, I can't win the work. So now I'm back to, right? As a project manager, you got to be a business person too, because now you're managing contingency reserve. So what's this other thing called management reserve? Why would I have another reserve?